This was easily one of the most fascinating chapters of One Punch Man ever. Titled The Abominable Fist That Turned Against God, we firstly open up to an incredible shot of this ever so monsterized Garou that is just absolutely brilliant. The associated text reads, "The ultimate in martial arts," and also, "How to be human," very obviously placing great emphasis on Garou and his journey. From there, we would have our collection of mostly A-class heroes and Waganma, as Lightning Max would exclaim that they needed to search for Tadeo, advocating that anyone still capable of moving should go along with him back to shore to search for the boy. However, to interrupt this would be the terrified outcry of Waganma, which even caught Max by surprise, and this was on account of what he believed to be a drowned corpse. What we of course recognize to be Fat Gum, which is pretty major because if you remember, Fat Gum had previously swallowed a number of injured S-class heroes for the sake of protecting them from the engulfing waves. Yet funnily enough, none of these heroes recognized the guy despite his especially recognizable visage, believing him to simply be an unfortunate civilian that didn't make it out in time, only for him to then roll over, revealing his identity and shocking them all. But here we go with the continuation of Garou versus Saitama, as the man-turned-monster would cry out for his opponent to take things seriously and stop playing around, following this command up with a sequence of accelerated fists to the point of several appearing to be visible at once. This will continue on for a while through the sky of course, as Garou has wings at this point. Now mentally, Garou was running through all the ways he could possibly manage to defeat Saitama. First up was technique, which if you recall from the previous chapter, he realized that in regards to martial arts, Saitama is a complete and utter amateur, and figured that his own exceptional understanding would give him the edge he needed to win. It didn't. Then he'd realize that Saitama's speed and reflexes were incomparable, so a contest of that would not be in his favor either. After plunging the dude into the side of an active volcano and seeing him emerge unfazed, it became abundantly clear that attempting to overpower the guy wasn't the right direction either. So now he was testing to see if an overwhelming number of attacks would be the solution to his problems. Yet all these incredibly devastating fists that would likely one-shot the vast majority of our cast would be evaded with ease by Saitama as he continued to wear a smile on his face, thinking it was pretty cool how it looked like Garou had so many hands. As in actuality, over the course of this particular attempt, Garou had further monsterized yet again, as he sprouted an additional set of arms and had these really cool flames running along his body. The attacks approach had failed him as well, and so Garou was now onto creativity, which was essentially freestyling and hoping something works. What was ultimately a pretty desperate attempt, but of course, these are desperate times for Garou. He would then place his palms, or at least two of them, onto Saitama, pushing him downwards. Meanwhile, his other set of arms gyrated with incredible power coalescing from his fists. They would then be opened up as he would use the force to send Saitama and himself downwards like a crashing rocket. The roaring outcry would make it oh so clear just how hard Garou was trying here. And listen, if you're trying to see more One Punch Man videos from us, be sure to drop a like and subscribe to Plot Armor with notifications on. But oh come on man, Murata truly makes reading this series such a one-of-a-kind experience. The artwork is next level, it is unreal. Garou's extreme power attack would see Saitama and himself plunge into a massive mountain and just invert the damn thing, plunging into the depths of the earth, the reverberations of which would begin to be felt on the opposite end of the world. Coincidentally enough, an international flight had crashed and was in the midst of sinking, the former occupants of which happened to be several Japanese students on a field trip overseas. And in their fear and panic, they would wonder why no heroes or even a rescue team had been dispatched to save them. Not to mention, they didn't even have dependable chaperones available, as one of their teachers would prioritize his own safety over those of his students. But it would not be long before the reverberations of Garou and Saitama's clash would begin to be felt. Beneath them would be the rise of a previously submerged landmass structure that dwarfed the size of their aircraft several times over. Meanwhile, the unsavory adults that put themselves before the children would plummet downwards and ultimately wind up on what appeared to be some sort of ancient structure that may very well be elaborated upon further at a later point in the story. The students were in complete disbelief, but if you notice, nearby there was yet another structure as well, so very interesting stuff. It looks like Atlantis has been discovered. And yet again, despite his attempts at being this oh so horrible monster, Garou in his attempts to do bad has done so much good. On several occasions, he has saved those with no other options, those who had been overlooked and or forgotten. And you know what, if we think of Saitama and King to be the utmost extremes, I'd have to say that Garou is essentially the middle ground between the two. He is both absurdly powerful and inadvertently one of the greatest heroes around, despite not getting the proper credit he deserves. And that's because he himself does not acknowledge what he's doing to be chivalrous and or heroic, which for any up-and-coming writers out there should serve to be a bit of worthwhile inspiration. You can essentially duplicate an already beloved character and shift their quirks just enough to where you suddenly have a whole new and very enjoyable character on your hands. And speaking of enjoyable characters, we transition from the other side of the world to a totally different dimension where Blast and his many mysterious comrades reside. The impact of Garou's last move had caught their attention, as apparently The space around the planet was beginning to distort with the magnetic and gravitational fields going haywire. This would therefore prompt Blast to open up a rift to observe the situation. And good lord, just like how Boros' move against Saitama forever changed the surface of the moon, Garou's move against Saitama has now forever changed the Earth. Suddenly, there is a whole lot more land, and it is unreal. None of these interdimensional heroes could believe their eyes as the Earth was bulging. These other figures would remain silhouetted for the time being, but the intrigue has only just begun as one of these characters with feminine features and elongated ears would be seen. They seem to be some sort of seer, or maybe even perhaps a potential esper, considering the whole observing through a pool of what seems to be liquid to further discern the situation. As far as they could tell, it appeared as though some oceanic place that had been subducted into the Earth by way of crustal movements had been pushed back out by some major force, which are concepts you may be familiar with if you paid attention in science class during middle school. But man, this next panel had me yell out in excitement when I first saw it. A particular visage that looked to be virtually identical to that of my favorite monster in the entire series, Boros. They then wonder who may be responsible for doing such a thing. And the way in which they go about saying this leaves room for inquiry as to whether or not they're genuinely in the dark as to who could be the cause of such a thing or not. Now, Boros, for as incredible as he may have been, is dead. And considering it was Saitama who did him in, we really have no reason to believe that this is Boros himself. That being said, Boros was said to hail from an especially powerful alien race. He just so happened to be the strongest among them. Yet considering Boros went out on a 20-year-long trek throughout the universe in search of a worthy opponent for himself, that was prophesied to be on a distant planet, a lot may have very well changed for his people in that time. Either way, if Boros' race is rather long-lived and his power was as incomparable as it was said to be, then assuming this person is familiar with his own kind, Boros should be able to be recalled or recognized. And seeing as Earth ultimately became the final destination for the powerhouse, if that were to ever be acknowledged, then a greater emphasis would likely be placed on the planet. Next up, we would then have a big cat-looking character who, based on that element alone, may be likened to yet another monster that Saitama thwarted early on into the series by the name of Beast King. But besides the whole lion thing, there's actually not much of a resemblance at all. They would express, however, their disbelief that any Earthlings were capable of such a thing, therefore equating this occurrence to merely be an especially major natural phenomenon. And this to me is actually pretty crazy, because it should be able to give us all a decent idea as to how powerful these guys may be. Consider the fact that just after Blast left to return to all these guys, Sage Centipede emerged, a ridiculously powerful creature and herald of the mysterious entity known as God that, although ultimately defeated by Garou, gave him a pretty hard time. To have vacated at such a point is to say that the threat posed by Centipede was pretty much beneath him and could be handled by those on the scene. Now, unlike Carnage Kabuto, Boros, or Orochi, who were capable of perceiving the vastness of Saitama's might despite his incredibly underwhelming appearance, Blast isn't so capable of perceiving the strength of others, as he himself met Saitama, yet placed the fate of Tatsumaki, who he cares for, in the relatively powerless hands of King. And if from this outlook King was to be busy protecting Tatsumaki, then he reasonably would not be the one to fight Sage Centipede. Meanwhile, from such a perspective, King and Tatsumaki are the strongest heroes possible if he himself is removed from the equation, which he typically is. And with the knowledge we have, we know that Tatsumaki is the only one that is truly powerful among the two. For these figures to be able to look down on the potential power of our S-Class heroes, and Tatsumaki especially, is pretty wild. I mean, if each of these guys is beyond Tatsumaki level, it's hard not to be excited for more to come from them. And of course, he challenges to come that will require such strength. And speaking of which, what took priority for this group beyond the minutia of earthly happenings was the opportunity such a thing provided to the entity known as God, as with this, the potential for it to breach the so-called dimensional seal had arisen, and it was up to them to repair it. So yeah, this fight is definitely impacting the future of the series in several different ways, and I love it. And on that note, getting back to the fight itself, Garou was still in the midst of pushing Saitama further and further into the earth with as much force and power as he could muster. But in the midst of this, Saitama shot Garou a look. And for as simple as Saitama's expressions may be, this really and truly just says so much. It is not a look of frustration nor anger, or just about anything you would imagine to be on the face of a main character placed in such a situation. It says, "Are you done?" Which caught Garou entirely off guard, as Saitama would then provide his forceful response by way of consecutive normal punches onto Garou. Saitama would do this as the two would spiral back outwards from the hole that Garou had created. The monsterized man would do his best to repel and resist with his forearms, but it was no use. He couldn't possibly keep up with Saitama, who was now surpassing everything Garou had done previously. And during this, two of Garou's arms would be utterly destroyed. In the midst of this flurry, Garou would recall the words of the late Sage Centipede that claimed to have risen for the sake of destroying the abominable fist that turned against God, the likes of which Garou had previously believed to be himself. Yet now he realized the truth. that the one being referred to was actually Saitama. Now this is very fascinating, as this may potentially allude towards some sort of connection and or relation between Saitama and God. When Saitama faced Monster King Orochi previously and absolutely dog-walked that thing, with the beginning of the encounter, like I said previously, Orochi was capable of recognizing Saitama's power to be incomprehensible immediately. As a result, he desired to use Saitama as a sacrifice for the sake of his ascension into godhood. A seemingly false notion he had come to believe in on account of a misinterpretation of a mural depicting his visage beneath that of God's. It would seem that Orochi was to become a vessel for God, but seeing as Saitama obliterated him, that prospect was therefore removed. So the aggravation of God could be as simple as Saitama robbing him of a potential vessel, thereby incurring his retaliation. However, in the end, this was not the complete and utter end of Orochi, as a portion of the creature was actually able to persist and replenish itself by way of consumption. This eventually led to it fusing with Psychos, who despite emerging as the dominant consciousness, would also end up contacted and furthermore contracted by God. Tatsumaki would be the one to take this mysterious fusion down in the end, yet God's prerogative afterwards became the attempted contracting of Tatsumaki by way of deceptive means as opposed to seeking her demise. With all that being said, to refer to Saitama as a fist that turned against God would seem to imply that said fist was once in alignment with God. Now, Saitama himself doesn't really know how he ended up being as strong as he is, so I don't imagine he was once a willing herald of God or anything like that, but if this stuff potentially ties into the origins of his powers, that is pretty damn cool and exciting. There have been visual parallels and the like, but just nothing to really and truly grab onto, but this may be the inkling that we need. But getting back to the fight, Saitama with his last punch would send Garo flying in a whole new way, as he'd crash straight through several mountains, before hitting the water where he'd be skipped like a rock before being left to lay on his back as he water poured down back on him. Garo was exhausted. The simple descent of Saitama caused such a major reaction from the water behind him. As Garo laid there, Saitama would ask the man if he was satisfied yet. Garo from here would try and get back on his feet while thinking of everything that had failed. It was no use. He was all out of ideas as to how he could possibly win. It was over. His wings were tattered and victory would not be his. With a defeated expression, Garo would wonder if this was the conclusion of his dream. His aspirations of becoming an absolute evil had been crushed. But if they were to ever fall apart, then he would be able to find some degree of solace in knowing that it was the fist of Saitama, the absolute strongest. Garo would then begin to chuckle to himself, prompting Saitama to question what was so funny. But Garo would not say anything back. But to himself, he'd admit that somewhere deep down, he knew things would not work out. Garo would then leap forwards and seemingly rush towards Saitama one last time. And as he raised his fist towards the bald man, he convinced himself that this was how he wanted to die all along, believing that Saitama would now kill him. But little does he know that throughout this entire fight, Saitama never had any intentions of killing the guy. And so, instead of hitting him, Saitama would just grab hold of Garo's fist, that was enough of that. He would then grip so hard onto Garo's fist that it made the monster drop down to his knees. Saitama would then say that there was no point in them continuing, then confirming that Garo already knew as much. And understandably, this would aggravate Garo, prompting him to command Saitama to just kill him already. After all, Saitama was a hero. But Garo has never encountered a hero like Saitama. And by that, I of course mean his power, but also his outlook. Saitama was now convinced that Garo definitely had some hero issues. As like a counselor, he would let Garo know that if there was something he wanted to talk about, he was willing to listen. Obviously, this was all very jarring for Garo, but Saitama in this time would notice a mostly destroyed home that would serve as a pretty good place for a conversation. And that is exactly where they would go. And what a great double spread this is. Garo looks pretty uncomfortable and has his hands on his knees in a way that seems to be respectful of his superior. Meanwhile, Saitama is pretty loose and relaxed with his elbow resting on the table and has even removed his boots. And like so many other shots lately, the moon is very much within view. The moon, which at this point has pretty much become synonymous with the representation of God. Now, Saitama approaching this subsequent exchange like a counselor is, at least in the case of Garo, surprisingly, the most important moment in the chapter. And I say this because Garo is truly someone with issues that have gone unresolved for the majority of his life. Regardless of how outwardly powerful he becomes, at his core, he is actually pretty vulnerable and has simply guarded himself a whole lot. He was viciously bullied with nobody ever listening to his side of the story. He wanted to do good, but at the same time, fully embraced the role of the bad guy that had been forced upon him like it had when he was a child. I mean, even in his training under Bang, it's not too different from a kid getting picked on at school being signed up for karate. The emotional damage and trauma doesn't just go away now that you can chop blocks in half. Garo, for as strong as he has become, is still someone in need of saving, and Kate Baldy is the only man fit for the job, the only hero that can truly see beyond the exterior. It's honestly beautiful. Saitama vs. Garou is now complete, and it looks like this especially long arc is finally on the verge of coming to a complete close as well. And there is just so much to be excited about from here on out, which if you'd like a little sneak peek into, I'd suggest you check out our video on the future of One Punch Man. As always, I'm Slice of Otaku. Thank you all so much for watching and have an awesome day. I love you.